Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. We're going to be talking about something really fascinating today. Um, how the way language changes affects us, even spiritually. We're both pretty familiar with the spiritual seek, right?
Yeah.
Well, they have this article called The Effects of Language Impoverishment on Consciousness and Spirituality. And we thought we'd take a closer look.
Yeah, it's a really interesting article, especially now when everything seems to be getting simplified all the time. Like, we always think making information easier to understand is good, right?
Right.
But when it comes to language, it might not be so simple.
Okay, so let's start with the psychological effects. Have you ever thought about how different languages can shape how people think? Like, some languages don't even have a future tense.
Right.
I can't even imagine what that would do to how you think about planning or even just your perception of time.
Yeah.
Well, the article talks about this thing called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which basically says that the language we speak actually influences how we think.
It's not just about communication. It's like language actually shapes how we see the world, how we experience it.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild idea, but think about it. If you don't even have the words to describe something complex, like a specific emotion, can you even really feel it fully?
And that article takes it even further, arguing that this applies to abstract ideas too. Like, if we only use really simple terms to talk about political ideologies, we might be missing out on a lot of the nuance and complexity.
That's a little scary when you think about it. And speaking of missing out on complexity, the article mentioned this study about how younger generations are using fewer unique words, like their vocabularies are literally smaller.
Yeah.
And they link that to a potential decline in critical thinking.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? Critical thinking is all about analyzing information from different angles, picking up on subtle differences. If our vocabulary is shrinking, maybe our capacity for that kind of nuanced thought is shrinking too.
It's almost like we're heading towards like a real-life version of Newspeak from that book 1984, where the government controlled people's thoughts by limiting their language.
That's a chilling thought, but it really highlights the potential dangers we're talking about. Not that we're there yet, but it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, so maybe simplified language isn't doing us any favors when it comes to our brains. But, I mean, I get it. Easier and faster is appealing. Who has time to look up every word they don't know, right? Like, I'll admit, I find myself scrolling through headlines instead of reading the full article sometimes.
We all do it. It's kind of just how things are these days. But the article argues that there's a trade-off. Yeah, it's easier to access information, but maybe we're thinking less deeply about it.
That's true.
Just look at news headlines. A few decades ago, they were much longer, more detailed. Now it's all about clickbait, grabbing your attention with the shortest, most shocking phrase possible.
Right, so we're taking in more information than ever. But are we actually engaging with it on a deeper level? Are we sacrificing real understanding for the sake of speed?
It's like we're skimming the surface instead of really diving in.
Okay, well, let's dive into something else the article talks about, how language affects how we experience our emotions. This thing called affect labeling.
Oh yeah, affect labeling. It's this fascinating idea that if you can accurately label your emotions, like not just I feel bad, but I feel anxious or I feel frustrated or disappointed, you can actually regulate those feelings better.
Yeah, you know what? I actually tried that the other day. I was feeling super overwhelmed, and instead of just saying I'm stressed, I actually thought about like the specific emotions I was feeling,
Mm-hmm.
anxious about a deadline,
Yeah.
frustrated with a project,
Right.
and just naming those feelings actually calmed me down a bit.
Mm.
It helped me be more rational about the situation.
That's a perfect example. Having a richer emotional vocabulary gives us more self-awareness, and it allows us to respond to our emotions in a healthier way. In fact, the article even mentioned a study from psychological science that showed people who labeled their negative emotions during stressful situations, they actually experienced less physiological stress, like their heart rate and blood pressure didn't spike as much.
So it's almost like putting a name to a feeling can help tame it.
Exactly. But what happens when we rely on things like emojis or hashtags to express how we're feeling online? Are we oversimplifying those emotions?
I see what you mean. Like emojis can be fun, but maybe they're stopping us from exploring what we're feeling in a more nuanced way. Like instead of using a sad face emoji, maybe actually writing out, I feel disappointed because could lead to more self-understanding.
It's a good question. And the article argues that this lack of nuance in online communication could even be making us feel more isolated from each other.
But isn't technology supposed to connect us more than ever before? Like we're constantly talking to people through social media.
True, but are we really connecting on a deeper level? The article says that nuanced language is really important for empathy and understanding other people's points of view. If we're only having superficial conversations online, are we really connecting in a meaningful way?
So we're constantly connected, but are we actually present with each other? Are we really listening and trying to understand each other's perspectives?
Right. It's like that idea from Sherry Turkle, Alone Together, which the article talks about too. We're surrounded by people online, but we can still feel isolated because we're not communicating in a way that creates real connection.
That's ironic. Technology is supposed to bring us closer, but maybe it's actually pushing us further apart in some ways. And what worries me is, are we setting kids up for a future where they just don't have the language to express themselves fully? Or even teaching them those words anymore?
That's a big concern the article brings up. They talk about how modern education is so focused on STEM subjects, sometimes at the expense of humanities. There's less emphasis on things like literature, creative writing, even just having good conversations.
Right. And then there's autocorrect, which is basically doing all our spelling and grammar for us. It's convenient, but maybe it's preventing us from developing strong language skills on our own.
It's like we're outsourcing our language abilities to technology. It makes you think of that Wittgenstein quote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world." If we're not careful, we might be limiting the worlds of future generations.
It's something to think about. So far, we've talked about how language impoverishment could be affecting us psychologically. But the article goes even deeper. It explores the philosophical implications, too. Are you ready to move into that realm?
Absolutely. That's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, so we've covered some of the psychological effects, but this article from the Spiritual Seek, it doesn't stop there. It goes on to explore how all of this impacts us philosophically, and I think this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. There are some pretty profound ideas in here. And one that really stood out to me was this concept of the commodification of ideas.
Oh, yeah. Like how we take something like mindfulness, which has been around for centuries, and turn it into a billion-dollar industry with meditation apps and everything.
Yeah.
Has something been lost along the way as ancient wisdom gets packaged into, like, bite-sized pieces?
Exactly. That's what the article is getting at with this commodification thing. We're taking these complex ideas that require you to really think deeply and analyze them, and we're turning them into like quick and easy products. It's almost like taking a gourmet meal and turning it into a fast food burger, you know? You lose all the nuance and the richness.
Totally. And the article gives other examples too, like feminism, which is obviously a movement with this incredibly rich and complex history, but it often gets reduced to like just girl power and catchy hashtags. Or think about how political slogans take these intricate platforms and boil them down to just sound bites. Are we really grappling with these ideas, or are we just kind of passively consuming them?
Right, that's the risk. And it all ties into this bigger trend of consumerism, right? Where everything has to be fast, convenient, easy to digest. But real understanding, it takes time and effort.
It seems like philosophy and consumerism are kind of at odds with each other.
That's a great point. And the article really highlights how that tension plays out in our relationship with knowledge. We're drawn to quick fix self-help solutions instead of wrestling with the intricacies of, actual philosophy. We prioritize marketable skills over humanities, education, even just the way we consume information online. It's all geared towards these short bursts of attention-grabbing content.
So are we losing our patience for complexity? Are we so used to instant gratification that we've forgotten how to, like, savor that slow burn of deep thought?
It's a question worth asking. And this all leads to another worrying trend that the article discusses: the erosion of intellectual discourse.
You mean like actual conversations where people engage with different viewpoints in a thoughtful way?
Exactly. Think about those old intellectual TV shows, where experts would debate complex topics. You don't really see those anymore, do you?
Yeah, it's true. Those have been replaced by talk shows that are all about entertainment and sensationalism. And online, it's even worse. The algorithms, they reward outrage and polarization, not nuance and understanding.
It's all about clicks and shares, not about genuine engagement with ideas. So we have to ask ourselves, are we losing the ability to even have these civil conversations, to truly listen to and learn from people who have different perspectives? Are we so stuck in our own echo chambers that we can't even hear what others are saying?
That's a scary thought. And the article also talks about the loss of authenticity, which I think is a really important point. What do they mean by that in this context?
Well, think of it this way. Authenticity is about living in accordance with your values, right? But when complex ideas get reduced to, like, slogans and trends, it becomes easy to adopt beliefs superficially without really understanding them. Like you could go on a yoga retreat for a vacation, but not actually engage with the deeper philosophy behind yoga. Or you could use stoicism as a productivity hack without really grasping the ethical implications.
So you might be going through the motions, but are you actually connecting with the real essence of the practice?
That's the question the article is pushing us to ask. Are we engaging authentically, or are we just buying into a trendy version of something that's been stripped of its depth? And maybe the most disheartening consequence the article explores is this idea that philosophy itself is becoming a form of entertainment.
Wait, philosophy as entertainment. What does that even look like?
Well, think about how some philosophers get super popular these days. It's not always because they have these groundbreaking ideas. Sometimes it's because they're controversial or entertaining. They might present complex topics in a way that's like provocative or even outrageous, but does that really encourage deep thought?
So it's more about going viral than sparking real intellectual curiosity.
Right. And then you have those TED Talks, which are supposed to be about spreading, ideas worth sharing, but how many of them actually prioritize substance over inspirational delivery? It's almost like we're consuming philosophy for the emotional high, not for the intellectual challenge.
It makes you wonder if philosophy is just destined to become another form of shallow entertainment. Are we trading deep reflection for quick hits of, like, intellectual stimulation?
It's a valid question, and one the article definitely leaves us pondering. Are we really seeking true understanding, or are we just looking for a fleeting sense of intellectual engagement?
So we've talked about the psychological and philosophical consequences. This article from The Spiritual Seek, it also goes into the spiritual implications of language impoverishment, which, that's something I'm always interested in. Ready to explore that dimension.
Definitely. I think that's where it all comes together.
Okay, so we've talked about the psychological side of things and the philosophical too. But the spiritual seek, they always go a bit deeper. And in this article, they also explore the spiritual implications of all this. And this is what really got me thinking.
Yeah, it's such a key part of the conversation, right? Language and spirituality, they've always been so intertwined. Think about it. All those ancient sacred texts, like the Bible, the Quran, the Upanishads, they're full of such rich language, metaphors, symbolism, all pointing to these profound truths that go way beyond our everyday experience.
Yeah, and it's not just the texts themselves, it's the language of spiritual practice too.
Yeah.
The prayers, the chants, the rituals, they all use these very specific words and phrases that have so much meaning. But if our language is becoming, impoverished, does that affect our ability to connect with those deeper things, the sacred?
That's what the article argues, yeah. It's saying that as our language simplifies, it gets harder to really grasp and articulate these profound spiritual experiences. We end up with things like, good vibes only or manifest your dreams, which, yeah, they sound catchy, but they lack that depth and nuance of traditional spiritual language.
It's like trying to fit the entire ocean into a teacup. Right.
Exactly. The form just can't contain that kind of vastness. And the article also points out this shift we've seen in what we consume, in terms of media. We've gone from stuff that was really intellectually stimulating to stuff that's purely entertainment.
Yeah, it's true. Like, I remember when you could actually learn something from watching TV. Now it seems like it's all reality shows and, like, sensationalized news.
Right. And that has an effect on our spiritual understanding. If we're constantly bombarded with all this superficial stuff, it becomes harder to engage with anything deeper, more meaningful. Because what we consume, it shapes our worldview, our values, even our spiritual beliefs.
So we're losing the language of spirituality and the space for it in our lives, all at the same time.
And that leads to another really troubling consequence, the loss of sacred language itself. Those specific words and phrases that have been passed down for generations that carry all that spiritual weight, they're disappearing.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. Like, think about the formalized language in Christian prayers, or the chants in Buddhism, or even just the loss of fluency in indigenous languages, which are often so rich in spiritual meaning. When those languages fade away, we lose something vital, this connection to something bigger than ourselves.
Like we're cutting off our roots in a way. And along with that loss of language, are we also losing the ability to really engage in those contemplative practices that help us grow spiritually? Things like prayer, meditation, philosophical inquiry, all of those require patience, focus, a willingness to sit with complexity. And those qualities seem to be, well, increasingly rare in our world.
Yeah, you're right. And the article contrasts those practices with, like, scrolling through inspirational quotes on Instagram, which is kind of a pale imitation, right? A
Yeah.
quick fix that doesn't demand the same kind of effort or commitment.
So what do we do? Is there any way to turn this around? Can we reclaim that richness that we seem to be losing?
Well, the article does offer some hope. It talks about how important it is to preserve sacred texts, to create media that encourages contemplation, even just to expand our personal vocabularies. It's a call to be more mindful about the language we use, the content we consume.
I like that. It's a reminder that we have a choice, right? We can choose to engage with language in a way that nourishes our minds and our spirits. We can make space for deep reflection and meaningful connection, even in a world that's obsessed with speed and simplicity.
Absolutely. By enriching our language, we can reconnect with those deeper parts of ourselves, with the wisdom of the past and with a sense of the sacred that goes beyond the everyday.
That's beautiful. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this, that the power of language is in our hands. We can choose to use it in a way that lifts us up and helps us grow, or we can let it become just another tool for distraction and superficiality. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation, and until next time, keep diving deep.